Right in the. I'm not too worried.
Oh, you brought your dinosaurs.
Never know. Okay, let's talk about dinosaurs and man. So which of these animals that's displayed is the oldest? So put your hands up. Yes, Sarah. So that is how most people would answer, and they'd say the dino is the oldest, but not according to the Bible, because on day 5th in Genesis chapter 1, the sea creatures and the air creatures were created on the 5th day, but the land-based creatures were created on the 6th day. So we have been highly influenced by the media and by evolutionary thinking to believe that the dinos were very ancient. And I'm hoping that I'll be able to dispel some of that myth today. Because what God said about that 6th day, he said, let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kind, livestock and creeping things. So that would have included the dinos and the reptiles, if reptiles and dinos were actually separate classes. So what I want to deal with is present to you that the Bible and gives us some information. Tells us that the dinos were created on the 6th day. They were actually in the Garden of Eden with Adam, and they were taken into the ark with Noah, and they came out and they lived after the flood. And that's what we're going to look at. So evolutionists will tell you that the dinos went extinct 65 million years ago. But they'll also tell you that pre-hominoids, not necessarily Homo sapiens, came on the scene about 2 million years ago. What's the gap between that? Any of the children? You have to put your math hat on. Oh, I heard a hint given. What's the gap? 3 million years, right? Well, I'll tell you that this is actually more accurate, because it is portraying dinos and humans coexisting. So this is actually more factual than what the evolutionists will tell you. So we know a fair bit about dinos from the fossil record, but we've also have historical records and historical artifacts that give us information about the dinos, and the Bible also talks about them. So, oops. The dinos were in the Garden of Eden because we read in Genesis chapter 2 that God brought all the kinds, remember that's not species, all the kinds of land-based and birds by their kind to Adam, and he named them. He gave them names by their kinds. So there was an interaction there in the garden between the land-based and air-based creatures. What is wrong with this picture? What is wrong with this picture? Kids, no hints. Yes. You're right. Dinos can't read. There's something else though. You're absolutely right. Dinos can't read. But there's something else that's wrong with this picture.
Here's an in here.
Sorry? Yes. The lady sitting on the lap there with the... Do you have a dino with you? Wow. What's wrong with this picture? He's at a restaurant. Okay. You guys... So what is wrong with this picture? Dinos did not eat meat when they were in the garden. of Eden, because at the very beginning, God gave to every beast of the earth and to every bird he gave, and to humans, he gave plants as their source of food. So originally, dinosaurs were not carnivorous. They ate plant material. So the question that we are often confronted with is, were dinos in the ark? One sub-question is, were they too big to fit in the ark? And another is, were there too many species to fit? So let's look at those questions. This is how most people picture the ark. Now I have to make a confession. This was painted by one of my daughters, and it was on our old church nursery wall, and it was 10 feet wide by 8 feet high, and it's actually quite inaccurate, but it is a cute picture. So it is highly inaccurate. So we don't need to assess what the names of these creatures are, because the kind is this giant beast, and you've heard of Brontosaurus and Gigantosaurus and all kinds of different names. This one's called Dragnotus, but this is based upon the fossils of the largest creature of this kind that's ever been dug up. Would this have fit in the ark? So let's see. The ark was longer than a football field, and it was as high as a 4-story building, taking what God told Noah when he said, build the ark. And he gave him the dimensions in cubits. This is a cubit, more or less, and he gave the dimensions. So, if Noah had taken this full-grown creature into the ark, yeah, it would fit, but it's pretty big, isn't it? But why would Noah probably not have taken the full-grown giant dinosaur into the ark? I can think of at least 3 practical reasons why God would have sent a much smaller pair. What would you think? Yes? Well, that is a good practical reason, but why did God send smaller ones? Yes? Okay, again, we're focusing on the size in the ark. There's some other reasons. Well, let somebody else try. Yes? You'll have to, yes. I think I wear hearing aids, so it's hard for me to hear. You have to be a little louder. Food. Right. Imagine the amount of food Noah would have had to carry in the ark to feed a pair of these creatures this big. Right? Massive amount of food. Take a smaller creature to eat less. Now think of the other end. After you've eaten the food, what do you have to do? You have to shovel it, right? The poop. So if he had a smaller creature, we're talking, but there's another reason, and that has to do with fertility. God would have sent a young, fertile pair, not some old crotchety thing, right? So, and a young, fertile. So that is likely what God would have sent. Now, everybody knows what this is. In fact, I think you got one on your lap. What is it? Yeah, T-Rex. Everybody knows that. Do you know that this was as tall as 2 African elephants stacked on top of one another? This was a big dude. Well, put him to scale. He would fit in the ark even full grown at scale. And so this indicates that when God gave the dimensions to Noah for building this ark, the ark was plenty big enough to take even the largest creatures if he was sent full grown ones. Now the second question was, were there too many species? So whenever a paleontologist digs up the bones, immediately he wants to give it his own name. In fact, if you look at the upper left one, somebody had been watching something or reading a book, something to do with Harry Potter, Hogwartsia. So they give these names to these species. But one of the scientists, he said that 1/3 of all named dinosaur species may never have existed. They were just different stages of growth and different appearances. Can you imagine if a paleontologist found a Chihuahua skeleton in a fossil record and found a Great Dane's fossil? Would they know that those were the same species, let alone not even the same species, but the same subspecies? They would give them completely different names, wouldn't they? So this is what happens when they dig up all these bones. So when God sent to Noah the animals to take in the ark, he did not send 2 horses, 2 zebras, 2 donkeys. He sent 2 of the equine kind. And after they came out of the ark, as they spread across the world and they speciated into subspecies, and lost genetic information, they became separate through time. Likewise, he didn't send 2 dogs and 2 wolves and 2 foxes and so on. He sent 2 of the canine kind. So it is estimated that there were actually only 55 different dino kinds that had to be taken in the ark. So at taking smaller dinos and taking 55 kinds, he only had to take 110 pairs into the ark, if you look at it from that perspective, rather than the about 700 species that paleontologists would say are out there. So the ark was plenty big enough to hold the animals in their size, but also by their kinds. I have a feasibility study out there on the table, written by one of our staff writers. And he estimates in that feasibility study that Noah had to take about 800 kinds of animals. That includes birds and land-based creatures. Not 800, 8,000 kinds. And the average size was a sheep. So we're talking about 16,000 animals, except a few more for the clean animals. So we're not talking thousands and thousands of animals. We're talking 10,000 to 20,000 in that range. So, what have you heard people say how dinos died out? What? Let's see if I can get somebody else. Yes. A big space rock. That's a really good way to say it. An asteroid or a meteorite, right? That's one of the explanations. What else do they suggest would have killed the dinos? Yes.
Maybe they ran out of food and there were so many of them.
Okay, that dietary problems is one of the explanations. The one that's more commonly given is volcanic explosions. Volcanic explosion. So, climate change, global freezing, those kinds of things is one suggestion. Another is volcanic explosions, and another is the big rock, meteorites or an asteroid. What is others but bad diet? Like somebody mentioned that. Food poisoning has been suggested. Weak eggshells, I'm not asking a question right now, are all given as suggestions. But what is wrong with these 3 suggestions? It's a common problem that affects all of these explanations. All the ones I presented. What's a common problem? Particularly if it was an asteroid, there's a common problem. Yes?
Asteroids only hit one area, not everywhere.
That's quite astute, yes. So why weren't the reptiles and the mammals that were existing at that time also wiped out? Why only the dinos? So here's some other information on this. This was published 4 years ago in Science Daily, and it says, in Death of Dinos, it's all about asteroids, not volcanoes. Okay? So you go to this site, Science Daily, and they're declaring definitively that it was asteroids. 2 days later, The Economist says toxic and climate-changing gases from volcanic eruptions. Simply, they're clueless. One prominent science publication says not toxic, and The Economist says it was toxic gases. Here's another explanation that sometimes is given. Alien abductions? What about this? They died out from nicotine poisoning? Or the hedgehog got them? Or here's another explanation. Somebody forgot to seal the boat the dinos were on with pitch. One more theory why the dinos died out. So during the creation week, God declared at various points along the way that what he had made was very good. At the very end of the week, we read in Genesis 1:31 that God saw everything that he made was very good. If there has been millions and millions of years of death and decay and destruction going on, we see the evidence of it in the fossil record, including carnivorism, because some of the dinos and similar creatures have been found containing in their fossilized stomach contents other creatures. So they've eaten them. No way can we declare then at the end of that creation account that what we're seeing in the fossil record is very good. It was Adam's sin that introduced death and decay into the universe. And the animals that died, the living creatures that died after Adam had sinned. And so every single fossil must have been formed after Adam's sin. And so that gives us a dating parameter in terms of when the dinos died out and how they died out. If you want to pursue this a little bit further, we have a video on our Creation Magazine Live, which we published, put out editions for 10 years. We're doing different things now with video. But you can see about this because some theologians are attempting to claim that the land-based creatures died out before Adam came on the scene. It's a compromised position. So every single dino that wasn't in the ark with Noah died during the flood. But that is the only explanation that the world's view would never countenance. They'll tell you everything, asteroids and climate change and volcanic gases, but it won't ever tell you that it was a flood because of a water-based death. If they did, then the Bible certainly is correct. We'll look at that in a bit more in just a moment. So now the question is, well, when did dinos die out? Because the evidence, we find a bone and we try to date it somehow. Well, the evolutionists will tell you it's 65 million years old, and I won't go into how they get that date right now. I have presentations on dating of rocks. But we would argue, based on the Bible, that that bone was buried 4,400 years ago, roughly, at the time of the flood. So here's a little bit of evidence to support the 4,400 versus the 65 million. For instance, Mary Schweitzer, writing in the Smithsonian, she had discovered in T-Rex bones soft tissue, blood, and DNA. And we know that organic material will not last 65 million years. Some of it may survive 4,400 years, but it won't last that long. After she published, she was ridiculed, but she's continued, and many other paleontologists have found examples in the fossil record of soft tissue and blood and so on. So the dinos couldn't have been buried 65 million years ago. Here was one that was 2 years ago in Saskatchewan, a T-Rex. Same type of thing, found with soft tissue and blood. And notice what the CBC reports. For centuries it's been thought that there's effectively no trace of biological tissue in a fossil. There shouldn't be. Well, they go on and say it turns out the fossilization process isn't quite as straightforward, or maybe not as rapid as we thought it would be. They now admit that there's a problem, but they don't have an answer to it. And there have been two reasonably significant attempts to explain how organic material can last 65 million years ago. One of our scientists with a PhD in chemistry has definitively dismissed the first one that came out dealing with the presence of iron, and he's shown why that won't work. The second one has more recently been suggested. But here's another interesting one. In 2012, at a conference that was held, some scientists presented 8 different dino bone samples that had carbon-14 in them. The interesting thing is that they dated these from 2200 to 22,000 to 39,000 years, not 65 million years. We won't deal with those dates right now because there are explanations for why those dates aren't right. But when you have carbon-14 in anything that was organic at one time, it cannot be more than 60,000 years old. Carbon-14 comes from plants taking what was a nitrogen atom that got its valence bumped up from cosmic rays. When through photosynthesis, plants absorb carbon to create their plant material. Animals and humans get carbon-14 by eating plant material. We can get it through a second, and animals could too that are carnivorous, by eating an animal meat that has carbon-14 in it. But the moment that the animal or the human dies, no more carbon-14 is being included in that organic material. And it has a half-life of about 5,600 years. So just to keep it simple, if it had a half-life of 5,000 years, and there's carbon-14 at the moment of death, in 5,000 years, there's only going to be a half. In 10,000 years, we're at a quarter. In 15,000 years, we're at an eighth. If we stretch it out to 60,000 years, there will be 0 detectable carbon-14. It's all gone. It's all decayed away, turned back to nitrogen. So it is impossible for there to be carbon-14 in dino bones if they're 65 million years old. And yet these two fellows reported it. By the way, every piece of coal in the world, every coal mine has carbon-14 in it. It could not have been buried millions of years ago. The coal was produced by the flood 4,400 years ago, and there's still detectable carbon-14. So what's happened was, after this paper was presented, and it had been peer-reviewed and it was presented, many people became incensed. This is impossible. You can't have carbon-14 in dynamo. We agree with that. But then what did they do? They asked the chairman to pull the paper, and the letter sent to them said there's obviously an error in the data. No, there's no error in the data. There's an error in their interpretation of the data. They can't accept the truth. And that was what happened, and then the paper was pulled. So these are evidence, and I have much more I could give you, but of the dinos weren't buried 65 million years ago. There wouldn't be any organic material. There wouldn't be any carbon-14. Some other evidence is mass burial sites. Really, the only way you can explain the mass burial sites with many, many dinos of different kinds all mushed together is through the Genesis flood. think of current climatic disasters that go on. 2 hurricanes hit Florida recently. Did any of those create mass burial sites of bones? Would a massive 100-year flood on the river? Would a delta? Would a swamp? You just think of any current geological process that's going on, and none of them. The only explanation for mass burial sites is the Genesis flood. Going beyond that, did dinos live after the flood? I don't know if in here you can see anything. This is on a wall carving made by the native peoples in Utah. Now you might start to see it on the upper left, but if I expand the middle one, sure looks like a dino, doesn't it? They were drawing a picture of it on the wall. However, the evolutionists dismiss it and they say it's a dirt smudge or something. Okay, maybe it is. But look at these other pieces of evidence. A pair of gold statues are in the museum in Bolivia, and they're dated from about 1,000 years ago. And they certainly look like dinos, not like any other creature that we see. From 300 years before Christ, we see carvings in China that have dinos on them. And here was one, notice the date of this jade carving found in a tomb, 2,000 years before Christ. And notice the amazing similarity to this dinosaur bone. Notice it's got the horn, the beak, and the flange on the back. Not only that, it's got the same number of toes of that fossil creature. Somebody saw this creature alive in order to carve that jade carving. It was probably one of these. Remember, this is not different. We don't have all these different species. This is one kind. They just, like dogs, have all kinds of different appearances. This particular creature had different looks, and this is probably what they saw and carved this jade carving. This one I find amazing as well. This is a cylinder seal. It's about the size of a spool of thread, and they would roll it out on a clay tablet. So it's about this big, carved around, and they would roll it out on a clay tablet. And notice this creature, intertwined necks, and a club on the tail. Oh, sorry, that's from about 600 years before Christ, at the time of the Persian Empire. In your biblical context, this was when the book of Esther was written, around that time. Well, here we are, 2,000 years later, and 10,000 kilometers away in England on the cathedral floor, we have a similar carving, intertwined necks and a club on the tail. How could anybody, 2,000 years apart, 10,000 kilometers away, actually have created a carving of these entities if they hadn't actually seen them? And what's interesting is the intertwined necks. Why do we have the intertwined necks? Giraffes will do this. Now, some say it's a form of dominance, and others say it's a friendly greeting. Depends on which biologist or zoologist you talk to. But somebody saw these creatures intertwining their necks, just like giraffes do that. Now, from a historical standpoint, Herodotus, a Greek historian, described seeing this giant flying creature with leather wings. What would we call that? A giant flying creature with wet leather wings. No, go ahead. Yeah, a pterodactyl. He described seeing this. Well, something was there. Marco Polo, he left Italy, and he traveled, this was in the 13th century, he traveled across north of like Afghanistan and Turkmenistan and all that to China. He described the flora and fauna, the buildings, the emperor, and all that. And when he was in China, he was heading back to Europe, and he was asked to carry a princess who was going to be married into Arabia. So they went down around India and up around into what is today Saudi Arabia, the Arabian Peninsula. And then he went up through the Suez, although there was no canal there, went through at Alexandria, and he traveled back to Italy. And he did this over about 20, 25 years, and he wrote about his trip. And in 1300, he published the memoirs of his trip. And he describes seeing a creature. Well, before I say that, one of the things is historians are amazed in reading all of the things he describes about hills and mountains and people groups and the cities in China and so on. But he describes seeing a creature that had 2 short legs with 3 claws and these giant eyes. He was describing a T-Rex. Now, the historians dismiss that. He can't be acted on that, whereas they're amazed at everything else he wrote. And he talks about, well, a terror it was, this beast. And he's describing what he saw. What do you see in this picture? Most of what you see. What do you see? Can you tell? What do they look like? I heard somebody say it. Cats. Yeah. Leonardo da Vinci. What's Leonardo da Vinci's most famous picture? It's a lady with no eyebrows. The Mona Lisa, right? But he was a good artist, and he went to the zoo and sketched creatures, cats. But notice in the midst of the cats, what did you see? He saw a dino in the zoo in Italy. Anybody know where the word dino comes from? It comes from 2 Greek words. One is dunamis, which means powerful. We have it like dynamo, dynamite, dynamic, those kinds of things in English. And then sour, which is lizard. And it appeared about 1840. What word was used to describe these creatures before the word dinos was coined? Up till now, I've avoided using the term. But what was the word? Yes. Lizards, did you say? That's good, but it's something else. Yes? That's right. Dragons. And we, in our church, we use the ESV, and in there, the word dragon appears. I just give you one example, but the word dragon appears. So we have an interesting thing going on here, because after Adam sinned, some of the animals became carnivorous, and they became vicious. Because when they were in the Garden of Eden, they were not vicious. They were not carnivorous, but some of them did. And we see the evidence of this in the fossil record, that they would attack one another, and they would attack humans at times. And it's interesting, in Genesis 9, after the flood, God makes an interesting statement about animals killing humans, and if they kill humans, they are to be put to death. Something has changed, and now animals that would have been all of them friendly to mankind are now, some of them are becoming antagonistic to mankind. I won't go right now into some explanation of why that change occurred. But the dragon legends come from the fact that humans interacted with dinos, some of which were vicious. And there's a story told about George, who was from Turkey, Cappadocia, and in the 3rd century. And his parents were Christians, and he was in the army. And his battalion, I don't know what that's called, cohort actually, they were traveling through North Africa, and there was a dragon which envenomed all the country and lived in a nearby pond. And people in the town would feed it 2 sheep each day to keep it pacified. And then they began sacrificing humans to the dragon, and the lot fell on the king's daughter, and we know the story. He saved the princess. Now, is it myth, legend? Is it true? Well, legends have some origin, in fact. But look at this one. Up in Scandinavia, Denmark, the Beowulf was fighting dragons. One of the dragons is named Grendel. What's interesting is if you look at an illustration that has accompanied one of the editions of Beowulf, this is what you see, a dragon and a Viking. That's what you would expect from in Scandinavia. But look at this illustration in an edition of Beowulf. When you read the description of Grendel, what does it look like? A T-Rex. And there is a more realistic representation of a hunter attacking a dragon, a dinosaur. And if you're interested, I have a few copies of this book. It's one of my favorite, and it shows all over the world where people interacted with dragons over the centuries. I also have that book. I only have the video of that Dragons and Dinos with me here. And you can read about it on creation.com. Does the Bible actually talk about dinos? What do you think? So in Job, God, after beginning to challenge Job and his friends, God says, "Behold the magnificent creation I have made." But he says, "Behold, Behemoth, a tail like a cedar. His bones are tubes of bronze. His limbs like bars of iron." So there's one modern translation that puts a little footnote on it, on that verse, and says either a elephant or a hippopotamus. Well, behold, Behemoth, a tail like a cedar. Does that work with an elephant? Behold, Behemoth, tail like a cedar. Does that work with a hippopotamus? Not a chance. Behold, Behemoth, the biggest creature I have made. Clearly, God is telling Job to look at the big dino in there. That's what he's telling him to look at. And so the Bible tells us that humans interacted with animals, the dinos that come out of the ark and had begun to spread around the world. And we'll look very briefly in a moment at why the dinos have died out since. There's another mention of a leviathan. That same modern translation suggests it is crocodile or alligator. Okay. But this is more realistic. This is a big creature that God is describing. So, dinos survived the flood, and they interacted with humans. So, final question is, why are there no dinos today? Now, some people suggest there may be. For example, Komodo dragons may be a dino, just what survived. Right? That's a possibility. But others have suggested you go into the Congo or maybe the Amazon, you're going to find dinos. Certainly. But one of the suggestions is, and certainly we know that the Ice Age had traumatic impact on the earth. What creatures do we know humans interacted with that died out in the Ice Age? You know one? Yes, we definitely know that because we find some of them buried in the tundra, frozen, and there are arrowheads stuck in them. Another one was a saber-toothed cat. So we know humans interacted with those two and possibly others. So the Ice Age may have affected some of them, and they died out like the woolly mammoths, the saber-toothed cat. Another is that after the flood, the earth was a lot drier than it was before, and some of them died out because of climate change, not what people are talking about today. And then they were hunted by humans. This picture here was sketched for an article I wrote on Nimrod by one of our speakers in Australia. And there you have Nimrod fighting a dragon, or a mighty hunter. So they were hunted by humans. It's interesting, when I was researching this, I didn't know that mammoths were down in Mexico. I always thought of them up in the Arctic. And the indigenous people in Mexico would actually dig a big giant pit. That must have been quite a pit to dig by hand. And then they would drive the mammoths into the pit. We have a similar understanding of that behavior when the buffalo were driven over. In fact, if you go out west, there's Buffalo Ridge and Buffalo Leap and all kinds of things where they would drive them over and slaughter them. So this is one of the ways they hunted them. Now people would say, well, how come we don't have skeletons of dinos like we do of elephants in our museums? Well, the interesting thing is the whole concept of creating museums with skeletons in them and all this was after the beginning of the Age of Discovery, it's called, and they started to create museums. If I had been a hunter hunting a dino, would I have kept its skeleton to put on display? No, I'd give the bones to my dog. I'd use its nice hide to create a vest to protect it from arrows, and the meat would have been in our stew pot. So here's an example from 1681 when an animal went extinct. And if you'd have seen this picture, you would have never believed that such a creature could exist. Oh, the dodo bird. Only 12 skeletons are known of this, and one of them sold for $400,000 in 2016. So, why are there no dinos today? Well, they died out during the Ice Age, changes of climate, hunted by humans, and the conclusion is we can trust the Bible because they tell us the dinos were created, land-based creatures on the sixth day. The kinds were brought into the ark. The fossils that we see were formed during the flood, and they interacted with humans after the flood, and many of them died out during the Ice Age and was extinct. This is strong evidence against the view that dinos were millions of years old. So we'll end there for now, and I guess we'll take a break and come back for the service. For those of you who will be here.